Good evening. Can you all hear me? This is a big deal. I've never been introduced by 5 people before. And I'm sorry after that I can't speak Croatian. The only word I know is pivo. So I'll have to speak English and hope that your English is good enough to follow me. So as I think they mentioned, I'm talking tonight about the relationship between science and religion. And I'm going to be kind of hard on religions. So if you're religious, I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings, but I feel obligated to say what I really think. And if you want to find in greater detail what I think, my book is on sale outside, and I'll be glad to sign it for you if you want. So the topic is science versus religion, which everybody thinks is compatible, or most people, but I want to try to convince you tonight that they're incompatible. They don't go together, and I'll define what I mean by science and by religion and by compatibility. So the journey started off with being an evolutionary biologist, and if you're an evolutionary biologist in America, you're faced with a lot of people who reject what you think, in particular about 80% of them. And so I started off by writing this book, which has been translated into Croatian. It's about the facts of evolution, and I thought this would change the minds of everybody in America, and that the vast majority of my countrymen would accept evolution, but they didn't. And when I tried to investigate why it was successful financially, but in terms of changing the mind of Americans, it was not so successful. We're still 80% rejectors of evolution. And so I studied religion, and I discovered when I did that religion. So this book led to that book, because when I studied religion, I discovered that it is like science and that it makes claims about what's true in the real world. But there's an incompatibility in that the claims of religion cannot be judged by the same criteria that science judges truth. And so this book led to that book. And I think this is basically the same path that Richard Dawkins took when he went from an evolutionary biologist to writing the most famous atheist book in the world, The God Delusion. But he was in even more trouble than I was, because he subtitled one of his most famous books, A Universe Without Design, and that's a direct slap in the face against religion. So he's in more trouble than I am. But nevertheless, it's the same journey. It's a journey from teaching evolution to having your teaching rejected and then trying to understand why and come into grips with religion and finding out that it pretends in some ways to be a science, but is incompatible with true science. The interest in the relationship between religion and science is growing over the years. So what we have here is a graph over the last 4 decades of the number of books on religion that are about religion and science at the same time. So on this axis here, we have the proportion of books on religion, and this is books in English published throughout the world. I don't have the data from Croatian books, but this is the proportion of books on religion that is also about religion and science. And you can see that this figure has gone up exponentially over the last 4 decades. Now, it hasn't gone up a lot. I mean, it's 1% to 2.5%, but that's more than a doubling. And this reflects a general interest in the relationship between science and religion that's growing. Now, if you read these books, I haven't read all of them, but you'll discover that the vast majority of books on science and religion try to show that those two areas are compatible with each other. We have hundreds of feet of shelves at the University of Chicago Library about these books, and the vast majority of them try to show that religion and science are compatible with each other. So the issue that I want to talk about tonight is this issue of accommodationism, which is the view that religion and science are compatible with one another, or harmonious. They can either be compatible because they're separate from one another and therefore can be embraced simultaneously, or they can be compatible in that they're friendly with one another, that religion and science are somehow mutually reinforcing. And this kind of accommodationism is widespread, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, even amongst atheists who don't like to criticize religion or evolutionary biologists. Here's perhaps the most famous scientist in the United States. I don't know if you recognize him, but that's Francis Collins, who's head of the National Institutes of Health. He did the Human Genome Project in the United States, or he was one of the heads, and he's an evangelical Christian. So he founded this organization called BioLogos, which had the aim of making evangelical Christians accept evolution. Now, it failed miserably because they just won't accept it. But this is an example of the kind of accommodationism that's practiced in the United States. And it's widespread. Here's a statement. I could give you many statements like this from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This is the most numerous membership organization of scientists in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of scientists belong to it. And this is their official statement about science and religion. You can just look at the part in red here. Science and religion ask fundamentally different questions about the world. Many religious leaders have affirmed that they see no conflict between science and religion. Now, this statement is the official statement, despite the fact that most of the members of this academy are atheists, and they don't believe this at all. But nevertheless, the statement is there as a statement of accommodationism, as a statement of conciliation towards the religious population of the United States. You could say, for example, that many scientists have affirmed that they see a big conflict between science and religion, but they don't say things like that. And I could give you many statements by scientific organizations like this, but you can see them in my book. Okay, so if science and religion really are compatible, and everybody supposedly thinks that they are, why is there still a conflict between them? Why do we have so many books trying to prove that they're compatible if we already know that they're compatible? The answer is twofold. First of all, they're not independent regions, and they're not compatible. They both involve making statements about the universe and trying to test whether those statements are true. And second of all, because they're not compatible, and I'll tell you what I mean by not compatible, and people really sense this tension between science and religion. And I'll give you examples of how they sense this. Here's some of them. For example, there's widespread opposition to evolution and global warming. Largely in the United States, it's based on religion. Okay, we have the organizations like BioLogos trying to harmonize science and faith. We have lots of books by new atheists that trying to deharmonize science and faith, and those books are repeatedly attacked by other people. We have the conflict between science and religion that is seen by many people, and I'll give you statistics on this in a minute. High rate of atheism amongst scientists. And I'll show you how high that rate of atheism is among scientists. And that bespeaks something fundamental about the nature of science versus religion. For example, this is the statistics from the United States and from Great Britain amongst atheism amongst scientists. The American public is largely religious, more religious than the Croatian public. Only 7% of Americans are atheists, and the rest of them are somewhat religious, and 26% of the Britons, UK, are atheists. 42% of American scientists are agnostics or atheists. So that's 6 times higher rate of unbelief amongst scientists than amongst the general public. So you have to start asking yourself, well, why? Why is this? What's the difference here? It's a huge difference. Almost half of scientists as a whole are agnostic or atheists. 72% of scientists at elite universities, and I don't classify them as elite. University of Chicago is classified as an elite university, but that's 10 times higher rate of unbelief amongst elite scientists than amongst the American public as a whole. When you go to the National Academy of Sciences, which is the most elite body of scientists in America, in fact, it's so elite that I'm not even a member of it, it's 93% of them are atheists. That's exactly the reverse of Americans as a whole. Or if you go to Britain, 87% of the members of the Royal Society are atheists. So we have this huge disparity between the average American in their atheism and the average scientist. Now, why is this? Well, there's 2 possible reasons. First of all, if you study science, it might make you lose your faith. And that's possible, and I know people that that's happened to. But the other reason is that people who are religious don't tend to become scientists. So I think both of those reasons are true, but no matter which one is true, and probably both of them contribute to this, it bespeaks that there is something incompatible between being religious and being a scientist at the same time. There's no other way to account for these figures. The American public itself senses that there's an incompatibility between science and religion. Here's the figures. You can just look at this first line. which is when they surveyed the American public, what percentage of Americans thought that religion and science were in deep conflict with one another. And the green means yes, and the blue means no. So you can see 55% of Americans already sense that there's a conflict between science and religion, despite being told repeatedly that there isn't one. It's quite interesting. If you look at the second line and you ask Americans, what about your religion? Is that incompatible with science? And then you see it's much lower. It's 36% as opposed to 55%. So people sense the general incompatibility, but they like to think that their own religion is more compatible than that of everybody else's. Here's another. This figure is the most frightening figure to me, and it's the only time this question has ever been asked of Americans. This was in 2006 by Time Magazine and Roper Poll, and they asked all Americans through a poll, if science found a fact that was in conflict with what you believe in your religion, what would you do? And you had three choices: reject the fact and embrace my religion, accept the fact and admit that the tenet of my religion is wrong, or I don't know. I mean, that's the third choice. What percentage do you think of Americans would reject a well-established scientific fact in favor of their religion? Anybody have any ideas? Well, with Trump president, you could say 95% or something like that. Yeah, it's actually quite frightening. It's about 64%, about 2 out of 3 Americans would reject a fact if it was in conflict with their faith. If you survey British people, in particular British Christians, because they haven't done Brits in general, it's 41%. These are very high, which means that in both countries, about half of the people will reject science in favor of religion. Now, doesn't this bespeak some conflict between science and religion? Because when they do come in conflict, most people, at least in the United States, will kick the fact away and embrace their religion because they hold their religion higher than science. And then my own special area, which is evolution or evolutionary biology, is particularly susceptible to rejecting the facts in favor of the faith. If you survey Americans in what form of evolution or not evolution do you believe in, you find that 39% of Americans are young Earth creationists. They think that the Earth was created in the last 10,000 years with all the animals and plants in place. This is the biblical story that you see in Genesis 1 and 2. 39%, that's almost half. And when I teach, when I go out in the public and lecture, I'm always aware that 4/10 of my audience don't believe a word I'm saying. Another 39% are theistic evolutionists. They think that evolution might have occurred, but they think God designed it or planned it or propelled it or somehow brought things to the ultimate end, which of course is Homo sapiens, our own species. I consider this basically a form of creationism because they accept the supernatural as having a hand in a scientific process. And finally, and this is the saddest statistic at all, 19% of Americans, 1 in 5, accept evolution as I teach it in the classroom. 4 out of 5 reject them. They either see God as having created everything as it is in the Bible, or God having stuck his, her, or its finger into the process at some point to lead to what we see on Earth today. Okay, and again, I think this is a fundamental conflict. It shows a fundamental conflict between religion and science, because the science of evolution, and if you come to my lecture tomorrow, you will hear the evidence for evolution, which is so strong that you would have to be misguided or religious in order to reject it. Nevertheless, people will reject that fact in favor of their faith. And these statistics come solely because America is an extremely religious country, and we have a fact here that comes in conflict with their beliefs. It's not just evolution that makes people upset. Almost every branch of science that is advancing causes some problems for religious people. Evolution is one. Cosmology, the idea that there was a big bang, that maybe a fluctuation in the quantum vacuum caused the universe to come into being instead of God having done it. That makes some people uncomfortable. Animal behavior, psychology, and neuroscience is starting to tell us that there's no qualitative difference between humans and other animals. I mean, we have language, sure, but some other animals have their own form of language. And in fact, we're on a continuum with emotions and behaviors and cognitive facilities of animals. And evolutionary psychology, for example, is making great inroads into explaining human behavior, not as a result of some God-given feature in our heads, but as a result of evolutionary biology. That makes people upset too, because we like to think we're special. Neuroscience has been started to tell us, and this is the lecture I'll give on Wednesday, that we don't have free will, that we're basically meat puppets that are guided by the laws of physics instantiated into our brain. Nobody likes that. Everybody likes to think that they could make a choice or they could make another choice. And I'll try to tell you on Wednesday, if you come to my lecture, that that ain't so. That we're just very complex computers made of meat. People don't like that. And finally, we have archaeology, history, and biblical scholarship. They're starting to convince people that the Bible is a man-made document, that a lot of the things that the Bible says, even about history, just aren't really true. One of those is the exodus of the Jews from Israel, which now people know never happened, but it's an important part of the first books of the Bible. So what happens is science is advancing. As it advances, it starts to push religion into a corner, and that makes religious people uncomfortable, because they like to be religious because it gives them some comforts, but they also like to be scientific at the same time. Nobody wants to be seen, except for maybe the Social Democratic Party here in Croatia, as an opponent of received science. So they're being squeezed into the corner by science, but they're also being squeezed by the new atheists, people like Dan Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and all. Many of you must have read these books. These are all science-friendly philosophers or working scientists themselves, and they've written books criticizing religion. So you're getting squeezed by philosophers and atheists on one hand, and by the advance of science on the other. What do you do? And for a religious person, you have to become an accommodationist. You have to somehow find a way to comport your religious faith with the science that it is publicly acceptable to embrace. And so that's what accommodationism is all about, and that's why it comes about, because people feel threatened by the advances of science and that they can't publicly reject them. And so they have to find some way that science and religion are harmonious. Let me define my terms before I begin my argument: science, religion, and compatibility, so that you'll know what I'm talking about. Science can be conceived in many ways. It could be a job, like the job I have when I go to work every day. You could consider science to be a body of facts about the universe, like water is H2O. But for the purposes of this lecture, I'm going to define science as a methodology, what I call the empirical attitude towards the world, in which you test hypotheses, in which you observe the universe and the world, and you have a constant attitude of doubt and cross-checking, and eventually you come to something that is defined as a truth, but it's a provisional truth, not an absolute truth. So I would claim, although people disagree with me, that when a plumber comes to your house to find a leak, or when your mechanic tries to find out where there's a short in your car, an electrical short, they're doing science, because they're using empirical methodology, they're using testable hypotheses, and they're coming to grips with the real problems. Science can infiltrate many attitudes of our life. So that's what I call science. It's the way of doing it. In professional science, we have our own special ways, including peer review of manuscripts. We use statistics. We have publications and things like that. That's what professional science is. But anybody can have a scientific attitude in how they approach the world. Plumbers do, mechanics do, astrologers don't, anti-vaxxers don't. Okay. The best definition of science I've ever seen is by the renegade scientist Richard Feynman, a great physicist, who said the first principle of science is that you must not fool yourself. And you are the easiest person to fool. So you have to be very careful about that. So science is an exquisitely designed, intelligently designed, but not in a spiritual way, process for keeping you from fooling yourself. It's a way of keeping you from having your biases confirmed by what you find. And I just want to say here that this lecture on the conflict between science and religion is just one war in a larger battle, a battle between superstition and rationality that's being fought in every political arena in the United States. the battle between fake data, fake news, and real news. Okay, what is religion? I'm going to use Dan Dennett's definition of religion here, which is a social system whose participants avow belief in a supernatural agent, whose approval you seek. Okay? Now, I know this doesn't characterize every religion, like Zen Buddhism, for example. Many religions don't believe in a deity, but in terms of the Abrahamic religions of the West and some of the religions of the East, this is a good definition of science. It's also accompanied by two other things, of religion. First of all, that religions, besides this, usually come with a moral code, a code that tells you how to behave and how not to behave. And it also comes in general with the idea that you have a personal relationship with God. It is a theistic kind of religion where you can interact with the divine being, and the divine being, a he usually, will hear you or help you or not help you, and you can communicate with the divine being. So this is, in general, what people think of as religion. Now, science has its own methods of finding out what the truth. Religion has different methods of finding out what the truth are, and they're based on dogma, authority, revelation, scripture, and especially faith. And this whole lecture is basically on faith versus fact. So what is faith? Well, I don't have to define it for you because it's defined in the Bible. There it is in Hebrews and John. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And that means belief in something for which there is no evidence, if you want to put it in plain English. The prime example of faith in the Bible is doubting Thomas, who asked to see Jesus' wounds to assure himself that Jesus was really crucified. There he is putting his fingers in them. It's kind of disgusting. And blessed are, in the Bible it says, blessed are they that have not seen and have yet believed. So this is faith. Faith is belief without sufficient evidence to command the assent of any rational person. And this is the basis on which religious people believe the truth statements of their religions. And it's a lousy way to do it, and I'll tell you why it's a lousy way to do it in a minute. Okay, but wait a minute. I mean, people will say, isn't it easy to show that religion and science are compatible? For example, here's two examples of religious scientists. I've already given you this one before, Francis Collins. He's an evangelical Christian, head of the National Institutes of Health. Here's Ken Miller. He's a Catholic, a pious Catholic, and he's a biochemist and a textbook writer at Brown University. And they're both religious and they're both good scientists. So doesn't that mean that science and religion are compatible? Because we not only have scientists who are religious, but we have lots of religious people who like science and accept science. Doesn't that mean that they're compatible? My answer to that is no, because it's an example of what we call compartmentalization. That is, you can hold two diametrically opposed beliefs and methodologies in your mind at the same time. For example, you can be a Catholic priest and be a pedophile at the same time. And in fact, there's an unfortunately large number of Catholic priests that have had that attitude, and it's caused a lot of scandals in the Catholic Church. And second of all, you can believe in marriage, but you can be an adulterer at the same time. So that's another example of compartmentalization. So I don't consider this religious scientists or science-friendly lay people who are religious to be an example of compatibility. I could consider them to be an example of compartmentalization, or cognitive dissonance, if you will, or at least some kind of cognitive fight. Here's another example of how people try to comport religion and science. How many of you have heard of Steve Gould or of his non-overlapping magisteria argument? Steve Gould was a very famous paleontologist. There he is right there. He wrote a book in 1999 called Rocks of Ages, in which Gould, who is an atheist, tried to make friends with religious people by showing how religion and science were compatible with one another. And this was his argument. I've taken it from his book. Science and religion are different in what their aims are. That was Gould's argument. So science tries to document the factual character of the world and to develop theories that explain these facts. On the other hand, religion, said Gould, operates in an equally important but utterly different realm, the realm of meanings, morals, and values. That is, science tells you what is in the world, religion tells you how things ought to be, how you should live your life, and what the purpose of your life is. So science and religion, said Gould in this book, were compatible because they're separate magisteria. They occupy realms that are completely different from one another, and they don't really have anything to do with one another, and so therefore they love each other. They're in harmony with one another. Now this sounds good. This is the most common argument you'll hear for the compatibility of religion and science, but it's wrong. Why is it wrong? Well, first of all, the main opponents of this argument are not scientists. We could care less about how people make science and religion compatible by and large. The main opponents of this argument are theologians and religious people because they recognize that their religion is not limited to meaning, morals, and values, that religion makes claims about the way the world is. And this actually is the crux of my argument, where science and religion are in conflict because they both make claims about how the world is. Granted, religion also deals with meanings, morals, and values, but it is absolutely grounded on fundamental assertions that are in principle testable about the universe. I'm going to give you quotes from theologians, so you don't have to take my word from this. And here's 3 of them from academics. Oh, first of all, let's go to the Bible. The Bible itself says that religion is grounded on factual assertions. This is from Paul in Corinthians 1. If Christ has not risen, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. In other words, Paul recognized, as most people do, that if you don't believe that Jesus was resurrected, then the whole basis of your Christianity falls apart. There's no reason to be a Christian if you do not believe in the resurrection. This actually is from the Bible. I didn't make this up. But you can also see similar quotes from scholars who are religious at the same time. And I won't read these all out, but I'll just take this middle one by Ian Barber, who is a philosopher of science and a religious person in Britain. A way of life, it is a religious tradition, presupposes a belief about the nature of reality and cannot be sustained if those beliefs are no longer credible. And you'll see quotes like this over and over and over again from theologians and religious scholars, that no, we're not just about meanings, morals, and values. We make statements about the way that the world really is. And those are scientific statements in principle. The statement that Jesus was resurrected is a scientific claim. Now, granted, it's hard to test, but it is possible maybe to test it if you could somehow find some ancient documents or bones or some credible eyewitness testimony, but it doesn't happen to be true, at least in my view. And Americans do believe in a number of facts about the natural universe. This is a survey of all Americans, not just religious Americans, about what they believe. And look at the percentage of them that believe in miracles and believe in the existence of hell and Satan, angels, that Jesus was born of a God, that they're absolutely certain that there is a God, that's 54%, that there's heaven, 68%. The figures vary between 55% and 85%, okay? And these are all things that are in principle testable. You could get evidence, for example, that there is a heaven or a hell. You could get evidence for miracles. We don't have any, not credible evidence, but nevertheless, these are factual things that people believe and could, in principle, fall under the ambit of science. British Christians, not just British people in general, they believe similarly, they're lower because Brits are more atheistic than Americans, but still, 81% of British Christians believe that Jesus had a full bodily resurrection. That the Bible is correct, 42%, that there is eternal life, 44%. Okay? These are all claims about the world, the way the world is. These aren't claims about meanings, morals, and values. These are claims about what happens in the world, what will happen in the world, what the world and the universe are really like. And in fact, this is Ian Hutchinson. He said that Gould explicitly was wrong, because Gould dismissed the possibility that religion could tell us how the world is. So Ian Hutchinson, who doesn't parade his religion around, I'm not even sure how religious he is, says that Gould's theory, whatever its attractions are to the liberal scientific mind, could never be Christianity, or for that matter, Judaism or Islam. In other words, an Abrahamic religion that does not make statements about reality or fact is not a religion in the sense that he recognizes it. Okay, so here we have, with statistics and statements and other data, people claiming that, yes, religion is not about meaning, morals, and values, at least not solely, but it also is founded on certain facts about the world. Certain assertions, facts about the world. Now, the other part of Gould's theory, which people don't talk about very much, is the idea that religion is the sole arbiter of meanings, morals, and values. And you can see this all the time. If you see a program on television on ethics or bioethics or morality, they bring out a priest, right? Because the priest is supposed to be the moral person that tells us what's right and what's wrong. But this neglects the fact that there's a whole tradition of secular morality and secular ethics and secular studies of the meaning of life that don't even mention a supreme being. So, for example, here are some of the primates. We have Plato, Spinoza, Kant, Hume, Mill, John Locke, and then in our day, John Rawls, Peter Singer, and Anthony Grayling. And these people are all in the tradition of secular ethics and morality. You can read their books. You'll never find a mention of God. So you don't need God to be good. And in fact, if you think you need God to be good, just go up to Denmark or Sweden or Norway, where the populations are almost completely atheistic, and yet they're not criminals. You can have a society that's based purely on secular reason and still be a good, humane society. I would argue, for example, that Scandinavia is a more moral society than my own society of the United States. They treat people better than we do, old people, criminals, sick people, etc. So Gould is wrong on both ends, that religion makes those statements about the world and that meaning, morals, and values adhere to the ambit of religion. Okay, so what do I mean by incompatibility? The incompatibility between science and religion, and taking into account that both of them make factual statements about the world, is threefold. First of all, it's methodological, how they judge what they consider to be true. Second of all, philosophical, and that's a bit more difficult to explain. I'll just do it very briefly. And finally, in terms of outcomes. The search for truth in religion yields a different set of facts about the world than the search for truth in science, and they're incompatible facts about the world. First of all, the methodology. I've already told you how science works, and you know how science works. We look for truth, we question each other, we make hypotheses, and we test them or reject them if they aren't borne out by the data. We have a constant atmosphere of doubt. We're constantly worried about whether the next guy is going to show us wrong, and so that's the way we arrive at the truth. In science, faith is a vice. If somebody said, I have faith that birds evolved from reptiles, which they did, but they said, I had faith that that happened, they'd be laughed out of the field. You don't have faith in science because faith is belief without evidence. So faith is a vice, but in religion, faith is a virtue. And this is the great con job that religion has pulled on the populace, the idea that it's somehow good or virtuous to believe in the absence of evidence. Okay, and that's basically the theme of my talk, and I'll give it at the end. In science, you can prove that you're wrong. We have ways of knowing if we're wrong. If the formula for water was H5O instead of H2O, well, we have methods that would be able to test that. But in religion, there's no way of knowing if you're wrong. If you're a Christian and you claim that Jesus was the Son of God, and you're a Muslim, and you say, no, Jesus was a prophet, but he was not the Son of God, how do you tell who's right? Here we have a conflict about factual matters, but there's no way to decide. The way they do decide is they kill each other. But that's no way. I mean, in science, we don't kill each other. We're very polite. We argue in print. But in religion, since there's no way to adjudicate these facts, you take arms. Not all of them, of course. Okay, and then science is wedded to the absence of God. I just want to make this point very clearly, that people say science is a godless endeavor, that we are sworn from the outset to keep spiritualism, to keep the divine, to keep God out of our laboratories, and that's what's the problem with science. So therefore, we're philosophically from the outset opposed to God. That's not the correct way it is, though. The reason science does not deal with God is because there's been no evidence of God. Back in the days of Isaac Newton, for example, scientists were religious, and they would regularly invoke God in their science. Newton, for example, thought the planets' orbits could not be calculated properly, and so therefore God had to tweak them from time to time to make the planets go around the sun. So that's the time when religion really was part of science. But we discovered over the last 4 or 5 centuries that talking about God adds nothing to our understanding of the real world. So we've simply left God out of science as an empirical matter, not as a philosophical matter. It just doesn't work to do science if you're going to invoke the spiritual or the supernatural from time to time. We didn't cure Black Plague by assuming that it was the product of God's wrath. We cured it by science and investigation of microbes. However, if you want an epistemological foundation, if time after time after time you fail to make progress, if you invoke God and do make progress by doing science atheistically, then you become philosophically an atheist. So there's an incompatibility in that fundamentally at the ground, scientists reject the existence of God because there is no evidence for God's existence. And so this is the sort of philosophical underpinning of the methodology of science. I don't say much about this because it's about philosophy, which is not my area. But I can say something about the outcomes. And the outcomes of scientific investigation are very dire if you use faith. Before the 20th century, this is what religion told us was true about the world. Things were created. We had Adam and Eve. There was a great flood. Prayer worked. We've now tested that, and it doesn't. And then there was a virgin birth and the resurrection, and we have no evidence for that. At least we haven't seen it in the last 2,000 years. But more important than that, the outcomes of these investigations differ depending on what religion you look at. So here's the history of religion over the past 20,000 years. We'll assume that there was one religion about, say, that's 18,000 years ago, and then over time we can trace through history that the religions begin to split up. So we have lots of religions in the world. Up here we have Christianity, and that's only a small sampling of the Christian sects. There's actually about 41,000 of them. And then here we have the Muslims, Shia, Sunni, and Sufi, but you know there's many more branches of Islam than that. Again, this is an underestimate. Here we have Judaism, lone Jews by themselves, but of course there's many branches of Judaism, Reform, Orthodox, and within Orthodox, etc. And here we have the Eastern religions. The point is that at various times over the history of human endeavor, religions have had schisms, and they've split off. My point is that these schisms are usually about factual matters. Is there a Trinity? How many gods are there? Was Jesus divine and the Son of God who did miracles on earth? Is there an afterlife, heaven or hell? Can you donate blood? The Jehovah's Witnesses say you can't. Everybody else says you can. Can women be priests? Catholic Church says no. Jews say yes. And every one of these schisms, in the Lutheran Church, for example, the Lutherans split in America because one branch said evolution is true, the other branch said it wasn't. So what we see here is that religions have no way of deciding what's true. And so that's why there's so many religions, because each of them makes different claims about what's true. So the point is that religions are not only incompatible with science, they're incompatible with each other. Okay? And that means that they have no way of arriving. That's the truth. There's science. If we're going to do a phylogeny of science, that's what it looks like pretty much. It's a straight line, progressive line, whereas we approach increasingly asymptotically towards the truth about nature. We have some detours here. This one, for example, which is still going on, might be whether string theory is true in physics. Here we have, for example, the assertion that the continents did not move, which everybody thought was true when I was a kid. And that was a dead end because they actually do move. But by and large, you don't see this here. Science is completely different. I can come to Croatia and talk to my colleagues, and we have no differences. And they could be Muslims, they could be Jews, they could be Catholics, but we all have the same understanding of reality in terms of nature. But religion, that's not true. Okay, does religion reveal truth? I've asked my students this, I've asked the readers of my blog this. Can you name one truth about the universe that nobody questions that religion has told us and science has not? Just give me one, and maybe some of you can try this after the talk. and nobody has ever given me one. I mean, they'll give you moral things like, do not hurt anybody if they don't hurt you. But that's not a truth. That's a moral claim, not a truth. I'm talking about a truth about the universe that's revealed by religion. And the answer is no. Religion has not revealed a single truth in its entire 20,000-year history about the universe. If you think it has, try going to Mecca and asking any given person, was Jesus the Son of God? They're going to disagree with you if you're a Catholic. So there's thousands of years of religious inquiry have not revealed a single truth about the universe. And more important, if you study theology, which I don't think is really even a subject, it's a subject that doesn't have an object, if you're a grammarian. I don't think theology should be taught at colleges or universities because it's the study of fairy tales. But, I'm getting off on a rant here, so I'll shut up. But theology has not homed in on any truths the way science has. Theology changes over time, but it does not progress. The only way it progresses is if it takes into account what science has found, like evolution, and says, oh, yeah, we accept that. That's theological progression, but it's not progression that's due to theologians thinking themselves. It's progression that because they're forced to accept what's true by scientists. I'm getting hard on religion here, but as I said, this is what I really think. Okay, now here's the way some people argue against what I've just said. But the Bible isn't a textbook of science. It's the Bible. It's not a textbook of science. And when you see this statement, and I see it very often, I always translate it automatically into my head to this sentence: the Bible is not true, because that's what it really means when you say the Bible is not a textbook of science. The fact is that for many people, and for all Christians, the Bible is in some respect a textbook of science because it tells them what is true. And this is a statement I made up. I quite like this quote. It's my own aphorism. It's the only one I've ever made up. That some believers are fundamentalists about everything, like a Southern Baptist in the United States, but all believers are fundamentalists about something. There's some truth that they believe in without evidence that makes the Bible a textbook. This is the truth that for Christianity, that Jesus was resurrected. You can hardly call yourself a Christian in this world unless you believe that Jesus died on the cross and then came back, and he came back to expiate our sins, and he's going to come back again. So this is a fundamentalist claim. This is something that the Bible is a textbook about because many Christians take the New Testament quite literally. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the tricks that theologians use to show, pretending that their work is a science, but actually showing how it's profoundly unscientific. And there's several ways that this happens. First of all, and I'll just take an example, they deny that Scripture says what it looks like it says. And I'm just going to use one example here, and that's the example of Adam and Eve. And you all know the story, how Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, and the talking snake, well, it doesn't say snake, it says serpent offered Eve an apple, and that was the tree of wisdom. They saw reality, and they started questioning things, and they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. But that we're all the literal descendants of Adam and Eve. Okay. Now, this is a fundamental doctrine of the Catholic Church, even today, that we are all the literal descendants of Adam and Eve. These are the original two humans, that they're the great-great-great-great-grandparents of all of us. And if you don't believe that, just read Pope Pius XII, and it's still in the Catholic Catechism, where it says explicitly, you are not allowed to deny that these are the two parents of all of humanity. So when you say that the Catholic Church is down with evolution, the Catholic Church likes evolution, remember that this is still part of Catholic dogma, that we all literally descend genetically from Adam and Eve. And this is important because we all inherited their original sin. That's what Christianity is all about. And so therefore, we're all born sinners, and we have to do stuff to wipe away our sins. So this is believed by the church. It is dogma of the church. It is assertion about reality, how many ancestors we had. And it is wrong, because we now have genetic data that disprove that. Now, this graph is a little bit complicated, but it shows, you can just look at the top, for example, up here, it shows on the vertical axis, the y-axis, the size of the human population going back at certain times in the past. So this is 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, and 10 million years ago. And this is the size of the human population at those various times, using different populations of humans: 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. It's on a scale of 10,000s. So you can see that way back when, the human population was quite large, but then it went through two bottlenecks, one here, about 1,000,000 years ago, and then the most important one here, which is about 60,000 years ago, and this is when humans left Africa. So there was a bottleneck in the human population. The important thing for our purposes is that we could get estimates of how many humans there were on Earth at given times in the past. Remember, the Bible tells us that there were 2 at one point, or if you believe Noah's Ark story, there were 8. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their daughters. But the minimum estimate that geneticists tell us that the population could have been in the last 1,000,000 years is 12,500. 10,000 in Africa and about 2,500 outside of Africa. Now 12,500 is greater than 2. Okay, so this absolutely, and these are conservative estimates, this absolutely disproves the Adam and Eve story. It cannot be true that we are all literally descended from 2 human beings. The Catholic Church is wrong about this, and their catechism is wrong. Pope Pius XII is wrong, Aquinas was wrong, St. Augustine was wrong, because they believe this literally as well. So what happens? The Catholic theologians are very distressed, because now they see that science has disproven one of the fundamental assumptions of Catholicism, and the whole church is in a tizzy with theologians busy trying to comport the scientific data with the assertions of the Bible. What do? They say that Adam and Eve was a metaphor for something else. They didn't really exist, even though the Bible said they did. It's just a metaphor for something that happened. Maybe our evolved tendency to be evil that comes from evolutionary psychology, to be immoral, to be selfish, to be grasping. In other words, they claim that Adam and Eve is a metaphor. And this is the way that theology works. If something is disproven by science, they say, well, we didn't really mean it. It's just a metaphor. But if you take that attitude, then you really get yourself into a swamp, because then you really have to believe that Jesus died for a metaphor. And because if Adam and Eve didn't exist and they weren't the fathers and mothers of us all, and we're all their descendants that are tainted by their evil from the original sin, then why do we go to church? Why do we go to confession if it's just a metaphor? In fact, you could say, well, maybe Jesus is a metaphor too. Maybe Jesus was just a metaphor for people realizing that they have to be good to each other, and there really wasn't a Jesus that did a miracle. The fact is that once you start saying that things in the Bible are metaphorical, there is no way to stop. There's no point where you can say, well, this is real, and that the New Testament is real, but Genesis is not. You just have to pick and choose, which is called cherry picking. And this is not a good way to do anything, much less to do science. So this is a fundamental difference between the way science behaves and the way religion behaves. In science, if you find a fact that is no longer supported, like the universe was not expanding, as they used to think 20 years ago, then a scientific fact that is disproven is discarded. It's thrown into the garbage heap of science. A religious claim that is shown to be false becomes a metaphor. So this is a fundamentally different way in which science and religion act. And one way you just give up what you used to believe, and the other way you keep what you used to believe, but in a modified form. Okay? There's number 2 ways that theologians act. They rationalize what you already believe. This is called confirmation bias. I was talking with Igor earlier today about confirmation bias in science. Here's a good example about what it is in religion. Nobody wants to die. I guess that most of you, if you could have eternal life, would choose it. Although some of the readers of my blog say, no, when I'm old, I just want to die. But I don't want to die. I would love to live forever because I want to see what's going to happen tomorrow, forever. But so religious people, though, they can't accept the fact that when we die, that's it. So they try to find ways around that. Here's a quote from a Catholic theologian, John Hott. In any case, if I was trying to elicit scientific evidence of immortality, I would just be capitulating to the narrow empiricism that underlies naturalistic belief. Try thinking about what that means in English. I'll put it in English for you in a minute. I will say, though, that the hope for some form of subjective survival is a favorable disposition for nurturing trust in the desire to know. This is called theospeak. It's a word salad, and I'll just put it in plain English for you. I can't use science because I don't have any evidence, okay? Because there is no evidence for an afterlife, although there could be. Your grandmother could come back and stand in front of you and give you facts about things that you could have no other way of knowing. And because what I will say, the subjective survival, I hope there's a heaven, so I'm just going to keep on believing in it. And stop making fun of me just because I believe in fairy tales. I mean, that's literally what this statement means in English, in plain English. I know it sounds harsh, but this is really what John Hott is saying here in so many fancy words. Here's another example. Make stuff up. If you're forced into a corner theologically, you just make things up. For example, God is hidden. Back 2,000 years ago, if you read the Bible, God was everywhere, working miracles, appearing in burning bushes and whirlwinds. Jesus was doing miracles. Now we don't see this. So all of a sudden, God has disappeared in the last 2,000 years. Well, why is this? Theologians, of course, recognize this problem. There's a whole discipline called apologetics devoted to making things up. And here's some of the answers they give about why God has disappeared. This is another word salad. It is essential to religious experience, after all, that the ultimate reality be behind our grasp. Because if we could grasp it, it wouldn't be ultimate. Now, this is what we call a tautology in English. He just defines God as ultimate, defines ultimate as being beyond our experience, and therefore God is beyond our experience. But this is not an assertion of fact. It's not even a philosophical chain of logic. It's an unsubstantiated and embarrassing claim. Here's another claim by two religious scientists, John Polkinghorne and Nicholas Beale. The presence of God is hidden because when you think about it, the naked presence of God would overwhelm you and deprive you of truly being yourself and freely accepting God. So if God came into this auditorium here and said, I'm here, believe me, that would overwhelm everybody and they would not believe in God for some reason, okay? This is what I call the Jack Nicholson, you can't handle God theory, if you've seen the movie One Good Man. But it doesn't hold up, because in the Bible there's at least 3 or 4 instances of somebody seeing the naked presence of God. One of them was Moses, who saw the burning bush, Abraham and Isaac, because God came down and prohibited Abraham from killing Isaac. And Job, when he was having his trials, God came to him in the form of a whirlwind. That didn't make them disbelieve in God. That made them believe in God. So this is just nonsense. I mean, you just make stuff up. And this whole thing about explaining God's disappearance, I think, is best summarized by the Alabama theologian Delos McCown. The invisible and the non-existent look very much alike. Okay, I think this is one of the smartest quotes that's ever been made about theology. That is, God is invisible because he is non-existent, in case you didn't quite get it. Finally, comport every observation that comes up with science with your faith. For example, before 1859, religious people were creationists. Darwin came along, and shortly after that, we had enough evidence to know that the Genesis story was wrong in the Bible. Now, what do if you believe in the Bible? You just say, well, it didn't really mean that. It's just a metaphor for evolution, and you can make analogies between the days of Genesis and various geological periods. What you have to say is, oh, but it's much better this way. So once evolution came along, then we have theologians saying, it's so much better now because actually this is the way God would have done it. Here's John Hott again. Isn't it a tribute to God that the world is not just passive putty in the Creator's hands, as Genesis says, but an inherently active and self-creative process, one that can evolve and produce a new life on its own? This is called making the best of a bad game. You have to accept evolution, so you just say, well, of course God would have done it that way from the beginning. But if that was true, why didn't Aquinas and Augustine and all the great church fathers realize this 2,000 years ago? They didn't realize it because they didn't have Darwin. Okay. So this is the last one I'm going to tell you, that theologians go about comporting science and religion. And they do this by using this theological sausage machine, as I call it. In the hopper here, you put scientific necessities like belief in evolution or the human population size. It goes through this grinder of theology and comes out as theological virtues. So whatever is a necessity is turned into a virtue by theology. And it's interesting, when I Googled sausage machine, looked for a Google image, it came out with this TSM on it, which is perfect for theological sausage machine. So, okay, I'm not going to go through this, but scientists, religious people don't like science when they talk like I do. And so they make a number of accusations against scientists. Here are some of them, if I can get them. Dear God, if you're up there, please make this work. Oh. All right, let me try that again. Dear God, if you're up there, please strike me dead right now. Okay, because I don't believe in you. I'm waiting. Nothing happened. Okay, that was just a coincidence. Okay, anyway, this is the way that religious people strike back, because they don't like science. Or they like science insofar as it doesn't contradict their religious beliefs. I'm getting close to the end now, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. And I won't go through these, but we can talk about these in the question and answer. Science, you can't prove that God doesn't exist. True. We can't prove that Santa Claus doesn't exist, or the Loch Ness Monster, or Bigfoot, or anything like that, but we don't have any evidence in favor of it. Science gives us no moral grounding. That's true, but neither does religion, I would argue. Science is a faith, like religion. And so this is like saying, you're as bad as we are. And this is not a very good argument to make for a religious person, because it translates into, we believe stuff for which there's no evidence, and so do you. So we can talk about all these criticisms, but I will be glad to, I don't believe any of them, and except for things like no moral grounding, which is true, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so in the end, compatibilists call for, or accommodations call for, a fruitful dialogue between science and religion. You always hear this over and over again. Let us meet together, brother. Let us break bread together. Let us have a productive and fruitful discussion, and perhaps we can come together. And this is my depiction of how that happens. But unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. There is no constructive dialogue possible between science and religion. What is possible is a destructive monologue, okay? And that monologue is one in which scientists talk to religious people and tell them what's true about the world. Religious people have nothing to say to science. So first of all, can faith contribute to science? And the answer is no. Religion has never done anything in terms of the truth in helping science progress, except perhaps for supporting it in universities at certain times of life. And there have been religious people who have been motivated by their faith to do science, I will grant that. But in terms of the contribution to our understanding of the universe that's come from religion, it's zero, okay? On the other hand, can science contribute to faith? And the answer is yes. Scientists have pushed theology forward, but only in the sense of disproving the claims of religion. So what we have is a destructive monologue in which scientists tell religious people, no, your claim is wrong, and the religious people have to sit there and take it and then go back to their monasteries and modify their theologies. But religious people have nothing to say to scientists, I would claim, that will help push our science forward. Okay, why does it matter? Some of you have asked me this, I have 4 minutes left here, are saying, well, why are you going on? Why do you go all the way to Zagreb and tell a big audience that science and religion are incompatible? Why do you do this? Why don't you just leave people in peace with their religious belief? And my answer to that is this, that religion is not a personal matter. If it was a personal matter, if everybody just went to church and prayed at home and did not force their views on other people, then everything would be fine and I would leave them alone. But this isn't the way it is. As you know, in Croatia, there is not mandatory, but there is religious instruction in the schools. And I'm told that 92 to 93% of the children take this Catholic instruction because they don't want to sit by themselves in a classroom and look like they're atheists or outcasts. So the Catholics have not left other people alone. And in general, religious people do not leave other people alone. They try constantly to come into my classroom and tell me that evolution is wrong. They try to get evolution banned in the United States, and they've just gotten it banned in Turkey because evolution and Islam are incompatible. There are three aspects of religion in general that almost force religious people to stick their noses into the business of other people. The first of all is that most religions think they know what the absolute truth is. Okay, so you think you're in possession of an absolute truth that cannot be overturned. Second of all, you have a system of morality. If you're a Catholic, for example, you may believe that all abortion is wrong. And so therefore you are forced to try to prohibit abortions in every country of the world because you think it's murder. Finally, you have a belief in eternal reward and punishment. This combination of these three aspects of religion makes two things. It makes religious people proselytize. It makes them try to force their beliefs on other people who don't believe the same way. And they're toxic because a lot of those beliefs are inimical, I would claim, to human progress. And I will list some of them in a minute. Here's one that's palpably true. Jehovah's Witnesses, I've seen them actually I saw them in Zagreb, but there are some they're all over the United States. They do not believe in blood transfusions because the Bible says something about thou shalt not eat blood. And they've translated that into you cannot have a blood transfusion in a hospital. So therefore, young Jehovah's Witnesses, and this, by the way, this proselytization is not just Jews proselytizing Catholics or Muslims proselytizing Jews or Christians. It is people proselytizing their children, teaching them from their very earliest days that they have to believe in these things. And these kids were taught from their earliest days that they should not have blood transfusions. So every one of these children, this is an issue from the Jehovah's Witness magazine in 1994, it's called Youths Who Put God First. Now what does that mean? It means they refused blood transfusions and died because their parents told them that it was not religious to have blood transfusion. Here's one of them. It just breaks my heart to read case after case of these children dying because they were old enough to be able to say to the judge, nope, I don't want a blood transfusion. I have leukemia, but God tells me I can't. And they all die. Okay. This is horrible. But this is the result of that kind of toxic combination of morality, absolute truth, and proselytizing. These kids have been brainwashed into believing this, and therefore they're dead. I mean, there's hundreds of kids in this magazine. They're dead. Now you can say, well, that's Jehovah's Witnesses, right? I mean, we're not Jehovah's Witnesses. Those people are crazy. We're good Catholics, or we're good Jews, or we're good Baptists. Well, you're not free of this stuff either. This slide really got me in trouble when I debated a Catholic priest once. But these are the positions of the Catholic Church that I would claim are inimical to human welfare. And these are positions that come from that toxic combination of absolute truth, belief in an afterlife, and a system of morality. So the Catholic Church, for example, opposes birth control. It opposes abortion. It opposes divorce. It opposes homosexuality. It is still a grave sin in the Catholic Church to commit a homosexual act. It controls people's sex lives. Is that morality to tell you how you can have sex and when? It oppresses women. It sexually abuses children. And it instills fear and guilt in children. This is the way that Catholics stick their noses into the lives of future Catholics, young people. And I would claim that without Catholicism and without these things, our society would be a better society. Okay, and I'm going to finish up with two quotes here. I'm almost only 1 minute over. You probably know, if you know anything about Martin Luther, that he spent a lot of time criticizing reason. Martin Luther's great bête noire was reason. He thought you had to have faith. You couldn't think for yourself, because if you thought for yourself, that's dangerous for the church. And so he made a number of statements about how bad reason is. Reason must be trampled, diluted, blinded, and destroyed. We must trample underfoot reason, sense, and understanding. Okay, well, you can say Martin Luther was crazy, and he was crazy. He was sort of insane in ways. But the same kind of denigration of reason has been carried on by Pope Francis. He's the liberal pope, right? Everybody says Francis is going to reform the Catholic Church. He says good things about gay people, although the gay policy has not changed in the Catholic Church. He's a liberal pope. He's going to make things good. Well, this is what he said 2 years ago in his Easter homily. The spirit of curiosity is not a good spirit. Okay, this is basically an implicit denigration of science. Okay, you don't want to reason too much, folks. Just have faith, and everything will be all right. So this continues on from the Reformation through the Catholic Church today. And the last thing I want to leave you with is, if I could just distill my message into one sentence, I would say that probably all of us have learned on the television, on the radio, and magazines that when somebody is described as a person of faith, that's a good thing. It's a compliment. But a person of faith is somebody who believes in things that don't have any evidence behind them. Now, in what sense is that a compliment? So if there's any lesson that you should take home from my lecture, it's that when you say somebody is a person of faith, you should regard it not as a compliment, but as a criticism. And here are other people of faith. You think of religious people of faith, but look at all these: Scientologists, Raelians, snake-handling cults, folk religions, believers in the paranormal, UFO abductees, conspiracy theorists, advocates of homeopathy and alternative medicine. And since I've come to Croatia, I've learned that one of your political parties is anti-genetically modified foods and anti-vaccination. Those are people of faith too, because they believe in things for which there is no evidence. So if you praise a religious person because they're a person of faith, then you also have to praise astrologers, UFO abductees, and of course all the social democrats in Croatia as well. And I wanted to read a quote. This is the last thing I have to say, from the famous American agnostic, Robert G. Ingersoll, who summarized the tension between science and religion in this one quote. And I'll read it to you here. "There is no harmony between science and religion. When science was a child, religion sought to strangle it in its cradle. Now that science has attained its youth and superstition is in its dotage," that's English for old age, "the trembling, palsied wreck says to the athlete, 'Let us be friends.' It reminds me of the bargain that the cock wished to make with the horse. Let us agree not to step on each other's feet." Thanks very much.
Thank you for your lecture, and we're going to open the floor for questions.
Professor Coyne, I just want to thank you for coming to Zagreb. That was a brilliant presentation, and I'm sure I reflect what everyone else is thinking.
I'm not so sure about that, but I do appreciate your kindness.
I'm an ex-Jehovah's Witness turned atheist.
Really?
I emailed you, actually. Lloyd Evans, I'm from the John Cedars YouTube channel.
Yeah, I remember you.
And I thank you for mentioning that about blood transfusions, because that is killing people.
Yeah.
I'm basically 100% on your side when it comes to God and religion, and I've experienced firsthand the harm that religion can cause. The only point of contention I have with your presentation is when you were talking about theology, because on my channel, I find that if I'm going to persuade people to stop clinging on to this comfort blanket of religion, I need to know a little bit about what it is they believe in order to deconstruct it. And in your own presentation, you gave a lot of information about religion that was basically about the theology of religion. So I just want to press you on that point, because you said you don't think it should be studied necessarily in college and university.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we had this email exchange, and I recognize your difference. So his question was that I basically talk about theology, which is I'm going to have to put this back on. Is what the sophisticated religious people say. Well, what about the average believer? You know, they don't necessarily adhere to this form of, can you hear me okay? Adhere to this form of sophisticated theology. And all I can say is that I've studied what the average believer believes. You saw at least two graphs of what the average American and what the average British people believes. And, you know, I've read a lot about that. So, you know, theologians actually are more atheistic than I think the average believer is. The average believer is just going to believe that Jesus was resurrected. But if you go to a sophisticated theologian, they may say, well, you know, that's just what I tell people on Sunday, but I'm not so sure it's really true. So I would claim that the average believer in general is more diehard than the average theologian. Plus, it's not the theologians who are attacking evolution in the United States, or it's not the theologians who run the Social Democratic Party here and oppose vaccination. It is the average religious person who does this, who takes to heart what's in the Bible. It's the average religious person who denigrates gay people. It's the average religious person who, I think Jehovah's Witnesses, they do this because, you know, blood transfusion. It's the average religious person who fights against evolution in their public schools. And when their child comes home and says, Mommy, I learned about evolution today, writes a letter to the principal saying, you can't do this to my child. So, you know, I think attacking the average religious believer is actually much easier than attacking the sophisticated theologian, whose arguments are often so convoluted and tenuous that you can't even figure out what they're trying to say. So that would be my answer. But, you know, yes, you do have to understand what people are thinking before you can engage them. Although I was going to say constructively engage them, but most of the engagement does not result in any constructive outcome.
Professor, you started with a good question. Why religion and science are incompatible? That's a good start. But you didn't continue in such way. It seems to me you turned to either religion or science dichotomy. And you used some rhetoric tricks like sausage machine and some swindles like Catholic Church has a position to sexual abuse of children. Yeah. That's not truth.
Well, I would take issue with you because the Catholic Church, perhaps up to the Vatican, but certainly to the highest bishoprics in the United States, have been guilty of covering up the sexual abuse of children. Now, I know you're probably a Catholic, right? So you don't want to believe this, but the Catholic Church in America, everybody knows that the abuse of children was covered up by the higher-ups, and not just in the United States, but also in many other countries as well. And I would say that that's endemic in religion because, first of all, the sexual abuse of children was facilitated by the fact that priests and nuns, in some cases, are authority figures that are seen as almost divine by their parishioners, and that enabled them to take advantage of these children. And second of all, the fact that the church is so powerful in many countries, including Croatia. I don't know if you had sex scandals here, but certainly in Ireland and in other countries, it's so powerful that it is able to cover these things up without being caught. So yes, I would say that the Catholic Church is guilty of covering up the sexual abuse of children. In terms of the incompatibility between science and religion, which you say I didn't demonstrate, well, I'd let the audience judge for that. And the incompatibility, as I said, is that what do you do when when religion says that Adam and Eve existed and that creationism is true, and science says it's not true? I mean, that's prima facie incompatibility, and there is no way to resolve this by saying that they're compatible. So that would be my answer.
Good evening, Professor. Over here. Thank you.
Where? Oh, there you are. Okay.
As a biology student with special interest in evolution and also neurobiology, I was just wondering, I need your professional and scientific opinion. How would you explain to an average religious fanatic, let's call it like that, the term of a human soul? So not the consciousness, but literally the human soul. Or would you deny its existence? Thank you.
Well, there's ways you can use the soul. I mean, there's metaphorically, of course. When they say an airplane went down and 200 souls died, they just mean people, right? Or you could say soul is the part of your brain that thinks about spiritual things, that feels awe when you see the stars. But that's not the way religious people mean it. So if I was faced with a religious fanatic that said there was a soul, the first thing I would do was walk away, because religious fanatics are not subject to reason. But if they were at least open-minded, I would say, well, what do you mean by a soul? Is it connected to the brain? If so, how is it connected to the brain? And then how does it live on without a brain that it's connected to? You know, what happens to the soul after we die? If that soul goes up to heaven, is at the same age as that we die at? If I die at 85, am I going to be 85 up in heaven? Or will I be 25 again? Or will I have all the memories that I had in my soul? And if so, how do those memories get? I try to, as a neurobiologist, you can be especially acute on this, I would try to get them to explain the connection. Because there has to be some kind of connection between the brain and the soul. And they have to be able to tell you how it works. And then when they start doing that, you're going to find that they just believe it because they were taught it and they're religious, and they really don't understand how this thing could possibly work or not. I don't believe in the soul, of course, in terms of an immaterial part of the brain that somehow lives on after we die. That's like believing in free will, and that's something I'm going to lecture on Wednesday. But, there's just no evidence for it. But to get evidence for it, you have to be clear about what you mean by it. And when you try to get them to say what they mean by it, then most of the time you're going to find out they don't even know what they mean by it. So.
Thank you, Professor Kane, for being today and giving us this lecture.
Thank you.
My question is it also wrong to view religion, in particular Christian religion, as it's mostly...
Could you, I was talking to the microphone, I can't quite hear you.
Is it also wrong to view religion, in particular Christian religion, as a way of proper behavior in a man's attempt in becoming a man of highest virtues? Christians would call that a warrior of Christ. I don't know if you understand my question.
Yeah, Igor, could you maybe repeat that to me or rephrase it, because I couldn't quite get what he said.
Is it wrong to follow, for a man in today's society, to follow a religion, Christian religion in particular,
yes,
as a proper way with rules, or so to say, in becoming a man of highest virtues?
I don't think so, because I can't think of a religion that doesn't have a morality that there's not problems with. I mean, the Catholic religion, of course, I just listed many of the problems with that. You have to be opposed to divorce, you have to be opposed to abortion. I mean, this keeps you from reasoning. I mean, you can make a reasoned argument against abortion, but if you're just taught that it's wrong because fetuses have souls, that's not a man of wisdom, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Just a second. Perfect that you mentioned abortions, because you criticize the Catholic Church because it's against abortions, which is killing, in my opinion.
Yes.
Yet you're against blood transfusions in other religions because it also kills people. Both are faith, yet treat life differently.
Sorry?
Both are faith. The ones that don't allow blood transfusions, that's one faith.
Yes.
And Christian Church, which is against abortions, is another faith.
Yes.
Abortion, by my opinion, is a killing of some sort. We won't go into that now. And the other faith is also killing people, but I don't know. Did you understand what I mean?
Yeah, but I'm just looking for a question in what you're saying.
I'm saying that you criticized abortion.
I criticized blood transfusion and I criticized abortion. And you're saying that they're not equivalent in your mind, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Sorry?
It's contradiction.
Things by being for pro-choice, you're facilitating murder, but then again you get upset because.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah, I can see why you say that. You find that somewhat hypocritical, but I do not consider abortion to be murder any more than I consider stepping on an acorn the same thing as killing an oak tree. I have a secular reason for that, which is based on the sentience of the fetus. That until the fetus is actually aware of its own existence, that it can't be murder, and it feels pain. Certainly in the first 2 trimesters, I would be in favor of that. So I don't see it as murder, like you do. So I can hold the position that blood transfusion should be legal for children, and that abortion should be legal at least for the first 2 trimesters. To me, it's not hypocritical. The reason you think it's murder is because your church tells you that, and because you think these babies have souls. But they don't have souls. I mean, why are you against abortion? And say a 2-week-old fetus, why would you say it's murder?
Because it has the potential to. It has the potential to be life.
Yeah, but see, we don't apply that in other areas of our life. If you step on an acorn, it has the potential to become an oak tree. But if I go into the forest in Croatia and cut down an oak tree, you're going to be put in prison or whatever they do to you. But if you step on an acorn, you're not. And you could say, well, that acorn had the potential to become an oak tree. It's the same argument, exactly. You know, your argument has to, in some sense, rest on the presence of humans being different from other organisms in their potentiality, and that's something special about human beings. At any rate, I don't agree with calling a fetus that's 1 week old murder, and so therefore I don't think that I'm a hypocrite if I oppose the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Catholic view of abortion at the same time.
Poštovanje, hvala vam puno na prekrasnom predavanju. Odabrao sam postaviti pitanje na hrvatskom jer mi je malo lakše elaborirati. Kratko je, kao što ste već rekli, hoćete prevoditi riječ po riječ ili reći? Okay. Dakle, kao što znamo, znanost se temelji na promatranju, eksperimentiranju i ponavljanju eksperimenta. Pa evo, volio bi čuti možda ako nam možete dati jedan primjer koji je sada moguće promatrati, eksperimentirati, ponoviti eksperiment što se tiče evolucije i promjene vrste iz jedne u drugu. Ne promjena unutar vrste, nego promjene iz jedne u drugu. Hvala lijepo.
Okay, cool. Go on.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the lecture. The question from the audience goes like this.
Could you speak up a bit, because I can't hear quite well.
So the person raises the following question. You say that science is all about observation and testing hypotheses. Can you give one single example of an observation of the genesis of new species? So I suppose that the person is asking about evidence for macroevolution.
Yeah, well, unfortunately you fell into a trap here because that is my area of expertise. I study speciation. So how many examples do you want? First of all, there's polyploid plants that take 2 generations to be created by crossing 2 different species, called hybrid speciation. We have seen this happening in 50 years of time, okay, before human eyes. What you're asking largely, though, is very difficult because it takes about, on average, 1 million years to make a new species. So if you're asking me to give you an example of speciation that a human has actually seen the whole process happen, well, it's hard to do, but nevertheless, we do have some examples of that. We have the Galapagos finches. We have a new species evolving there. We have this happening in plants through the process of polyploidy repeatedly. And we have the fossil record. Although we weren't there to see the fossils, we see the traces. I mean, what you're sort of asking me is to say, you get up in the morning and you go to bed at night and you watch the sun. Prove that we go around the sun. Okay, you can't do that. It takes a year's worth of observations to do that. But nevertheless, you're wrong if you say that we have no examples of speciation observed in human time. It's very difficult, but we have some of them, and certainly enough, given that it takes about 1 million years, to refute the claim that creationists make that species do not split at all because we haven't seen it happen. Let me just say one more thing. The idea that, and this is a very common view of creationists, that evolution did not happen because we did not see it happen, that we have to actually see something evolve before our eyes. Well, there's 2 things wrong with that. First of all, evolution is very slow in general, and we don't usually see things evolve. We're not around long enough. Yet we still have seen things evolve, and I'll give some examples tomorrow of that. And second of all, if we had to see something happen in order to believe it, then the whole discipline of history would be gone. Have you met Abraham Lincoln or Julius Caesar? No, but we believe they exist because they have left their historical traces behind them in written record and eyewitness accounts. Same thing with evolution. We have the fossil record. We have genes in our genomes that don't do anything but are inherited from our ancestors. You'll learn tomorrow that I have genes in my DNA for making egg yolks, even though no human makes egg yolks. Our reptilian ancestors did, but that DNA is still in there. So there's just like we have traces of Julius Caesar and Abraham Lincoln and other great men of the past, we have traces of evolution in fossil record, in people's bodies, in DNA, in biogeography, and in many other ways too. That's the subject of my first book. So, in terms of speciation, I would recommend you read the chapter on speciation and why evolution is true, where I give some examples of that.
Thank you for your lecture. I have an impression, and you will tell me whether I'm wrong.
Oh, could you speak up a little? Sorry.
I have an impression, and you will tell me whether I'm wrong, that you tend to neglect the differences between specific religious practices or religions as such. Of course, you will probably want to claim that Jehovah's Witnesses are more dangerous than, on average, than Catholics, or maybe Orthodox Christians.
I don't know. Yeah.
But probably you would say, in terms of how many members of these denominations there are, then perhaps Catholics would be more dangerous than Jehovah's Witnesses. Am I right?
Is that your question?
No. Now comes my question.
Okay, you just want my opinion.
Yeah.
Well, my first opinion is that, probably the Catholic Church, by prohibiting the use of contraception in Africa, killed millions of people from AIDS, whereas the Jehovah's Witnesses are relatively small. And it's not just that. The Catholic Church has done innumerable harms to children. It's terrorized people. I mean, it killed, during the Crusades, it killed a lot of Muslims and stuff like that. So I would probably claim, but I don't know the data for sure, that the Catholicism has been...
You're speaking of the past now, but what I would be interested in, when you would compare Christianity to Islam, do you find these religions equally dangerous today?
No, my view is, I might be killed for saying this, that right now, at present, Islam is the most dangerous religion on the planet because of its proselytizing. It has a very toxic combination of proselytizing because it is part of the Muslim faith. If not all Muslims believe this, of course, but it is part of the Muslim faith to convert everybody else, the rest of the world, to Islam. And the tenets of Islam are more invidious than the tenets of Catholicism. Catholicism does not say you should kill those who leave the church. I mean, they make it hard for you to leave the church. You have to be excommunicated in general. And women are generally second-class citizens in the Catholic Church, but not like they are in Islam. When a Catholic woman goes out, she doesn't have to cover herself in most places, okay? So, if I was going to ask which religions have varied and how dangerous they are, depending on whether they have political power or not. Right now, I would say Islam is the most dangerous faith.
Here's a question. How would you comment on our current Croatian situation? Namely, we have religion taught in schools, but not objectively. It's like religion with a dogma. You have to believe this or you fail the class. So how would you comment that in public schools, government is actually actively encouraging little children to go to these lectures? And would this fact actually deny us the status of secular society?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't remember, Igor, where was my interview? And I was just interviewed about this.
Index.
Yeah, in Index. So there's a big interview in Index where they asked me about that. And my answer to the question is, it is absolutely reprehensible for a secular country, and Croatia pretends to be a secular country, to have religious education in its schools. And it's not religious education, it's Catholic education. I have no objection to classes in comparative religion where the different types of religion are taught, because it is a sociological phenomenon. Although I think those classes would be almost impossible to teach, because like Muslims and lots of Catholics would want their particular viewpoint taught more, or the particular things taught more. So if I was in Croatia and I was a liberal and a secular person, I would be spending a lot of effort trying to get religious education out of schools. It's not only propagandizes children, it wastes classroom time, and it makes those children who opt out of religious education feel bad, because I'm told they sit by themselves in a classroom for an hour, and their classmates are going to think that they're like atheists. Well, they could be atheists, or that but certainly that they're bad children because they don't believe. So, I think in America, we don't do that. We have our Constitution prohibits any religious education in the public schools. And so in that sense, we're a secular country by fiat, and so is Croatia. Yeah. So I just say, stop it. Just stop it right now. Get the religion out of the schools. Leave it in the churches where it belongs. Let the kids learn other stuff, okay, like science, for example.
Okay, just a quick question. Do you think we should drop all religion, just completely move on? And if so, how do you explain the Soviet Russia, which is arguably the only country ever that completely banned religion, and it turned into a great disaster? Thank you.
So wait a minute. So you have a two-part question. First of all, should we drop religion altogether? What you're asking me then is, do I think that the world would be a better place if we got rid of religion? Is that what you're asking me? Then the answer to that is yes, it would be. And people will say, well, we need religion. And maybe the second part of your question, where the Soviets, and I think in Croatia, and certainly in Poland, where religion was suppressed, it came back again. It never really disappeared. It was just quiet, right? And it came back again. So people say, well, we cannot live without religion. It's always a ubiquitous feature of human societies. And my answer to that is just one word, which is Scandinavia. Scandinavia, and this is true of the West in general, but the West has been becoming more secular for the last 200 years. 200 years ago, everybody in Scandinavia was a Lutheran, right? They went to church and stuff. Now, everybody in Scandinavia, not everybody, I'm exaggerating here, but they're an atheist. Now, what happened to Scandinavia? They do not have religion. People will get their kids baptized for sure, but they don't go to church. If you ask them, and there's books on this, do you believe in God? They just laugh at you. And look at Scandinavia as a society. It is Denmark, Sweden, Norway. They're good societies. They're some of the best societies on earth in terms of the well-being, the happiness of their inhabitants, how well they take care of the least advantaged people in society, the old, the sick, the poor. If you do a ranking, and I did this on my website, of happiness versus religion, and the UN every 5 years, or every year I think, compiles what they call the happiness index. They just go to various countries and ask people, well, how do you feel? Do you feel like you're doing okay? Are you happy? And then they look at the religiosity of the countries. Well, the graph of religiousness versus happiness looks like that. The happiest countries in the world are countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland. The unhappiest countries in the world are countries like Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East. There's a definite negative correlation between religion. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that religion causes unhappiness. It could just be a product of unhappiness. But what it does mean is that you can have a good society, a moral society, a well-functioning society without any religion whatsoever. And Scandinavia proves that. And that proves that we don't need religion to have a well-functioning world. It's a superstition that has seen its time. It's part of the childhood of our species. It's time to put those toys away and grow up.
All right. Thank you, Professor Coyne. Thanks everybody for visiting. Hvala svima što ste došli. Simpozij se nastavlja sa još 2 druga predavanja. Jedno je sutra na Horvatovcu u zgradi PMF-a, zašto je evolucija istina, u 18 sati. I u srijedu isto u 18 sati na Filozofskom fakultetu. 17. Na Filozofskom fakultetu profesor Coyne će pričati o tome zašto nemamo slobodnu volju. Hvala vam puno još jedan pljesak za profesora Coyna.